Few structures are more important to daily life than bridges. They are an essential part of our transportation infrastructure, allowing safe passage of people and vehicles across soaring gorges, deep bodies of water, even other roadways. People have been building bridges since ancient times, and the art has evolved into an exact science as we've gone from simple wood and rope constructions to the towering steel and concrete behemoths we see today. Bridge building, like many other skills, is built upon failure. Engineers study what didn't work in order to make new bridges stronger, more resilient, safer. And few bridge failures have been studied in greater detail than the dramatic collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge just 4 months after it opened in 1940. All of us have seen the video, the brand new suspension bridge buffeting in the wind, seesawing back and forth in such a pronounced way, it almost doesn't look real. The film of the collapse of the bridge, nicknamed Galloping Gertie, can be considered an early example of a viral video, as it appeared in newsreels around the world and continues to be shown over 80 years later, both as a visual oddity as well as a cautionary tale. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge failure is a story of humanity's hubris and the fate of the overwhelming power of Mother Nature. However, it is also a story of learning from mistakes, as engineers realized they needed to rethink the science of bridge building to prevent a similar failure from happening again. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Edelman, so be sure to show them some love as you deploy your likes and do all the things that help keep the eldritch beast that is the YouTube algorithm going. Let's get to it. The northwest corner of the U.S. state of Washington is divided for almost 100 miles by the waters of Puget Sound. As the second largest estuary in the United States, the Sound has been the backbone of Washington's marine economy since its establishment, and most of the state's largest cities, including Seattle, were founded along its shoreline. However, what was a strength in some respects was a weakness in others. The western shoreline of the Sound, the Kitsap Peninsula, was sparsely populated compared to the eastern shore, since access was available only via ferry service or by traveling a long, circuitous route around the southern end of Puget Sound. As the 20th century brought with it the rise of the automobile, it was apparent to everyone that a road bridge was needed to connect the two sides. It was even considered a matter of national security by the U.S. Navy, who had built one of their largest shipyards on Kitsap, next to the city of Bremerton. The most obvious place to build a bridge was over the Tacoma Narrows, where the Sound narrows to less than a mile across. It is also just to the west of the city of Tacoma, the third largest in the state, 40 miles south of Seattle. There had been talks to build a railroad bridge over the Narrows as far back as 1889, but it wasn't until the 1920s, when the population on Kitsap was growing as a result of the naval base, that discussions about a bridge for car and truck traffic really picked up steam. However, finding the money to pay for it, which was contentious from the start, was made even more complicated by the onset of the Great Depression. It wasn't until 1938 that funding was secured from the Federal Public Works Administration, or the PWA. The designer of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, Leon Moiseev, was one of the most respected bridge engineers in the world. Born in Latvia, he had immigrated to the United States as a teenager with his family and graduated from Columbia University, then went on to enjoy a long career as one of the foremost experts on suspension bridges, helping to design and assemble virtually every major suspension bridge in America over the span of 30 years. From the Manhattan Bridge, opened in 1909, to the mighty Golden Gate Bridge, completed in 1937. However, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was the first project to which he was named chief engineer, and was to be his crowning achievement, building what Moiseev would call the most beautiful bridge in the world. You know what's scarier than watching your pet project vibrate and collapse into the river? Discovering how much of my data was harvested by shady websites. And it was certainly alarming discovering how much of my personal information was with data brokers. With today's sponsor, Delete Me, I found out that 18 of these companies had my personal information. Data brokers are companies that snatch up your personal info and sell or rent that information for a nominal price. And it's not just social media websites. They get this information from all over the internet, including government public records. Now, I'm pretty careful when it comes to what I do and don't do online, but you know something? You can never be too careful. This information included my name, age, past addresses, family members, marital status, and my wife's name as well, and with Delete Me, I was able to get it removed from these websites. Now, full disclosure, you can absolutely do this on your own. Every one of these data brokers has an opt-out process that you can follow. But if you're like me and you don't have the several hours it would likely take to follow that process for every website that has your information, Delete Me will help keep your data more secure by doing all of that for you. All you have to do is sign up, follow the instructions in the welcome email, and tell them what information you'd like to be removed. So now is the time to safeguard your online privacy. Get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/geographics and use promo code Geographics at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/geographics, code Geographics. The basic design of a suspension bridge is deceptively simple. Unlike a traditional bridge where the road deck is built on top of supporting piers, the road deck on a suspension bridge is suspended from huge cables, each one made up of thousands of smaller strands, which are draped over two tall towers called pylons, and then anchored on each end to connection points on land. This bridge design was considered particularly useful for water crossings, since it allows for a bridge to be built without impeding ship traffic below. The first modern suspension bridges were built in the early 19th century, but the design came into its own with the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883. In the 50 years since then, suspension bridges had been getting longer and longer, eschewing masonry for naked structural steel, becoming some of the most iconic structures in America in the process. They were also getting slimmer. Moiseev had written a widely read paper about his theory of elastic distribution, which claimed that on long suspension bridges, the cables that hold up the road deck will absorb up to half of the load placed on the bridge by the force of wind blowing against it. This meant that the previous practice of stiffening the road deck with a deep truss structure was unnecessary to prevent the bridge from moving around when the wind was blowing. So the bridge would need less structural steel, saving money on construction costs. For the cash-strapped Washington State Toll Bridge Authority, Moiseev's design was great news, as it meant the bridge could be built for only $6.4 million, as opposed to the estimated $11 million a more conventional bridge design would have cost. Construction began in January 1939, with the laying of the concrete foundation piers for the two pylons. Each pier needed to be driven deep under the waters of Puget Sound and into the rock underneath that to ensure stability. At the time, some of the deepest bridge piers in the world. Each one was taller than the height of a 20-story building. Next, the two pylons were erected, each one 446 feet tall. After that came the labor-intensive task of spinning more than 6,000 wires into two massive cables that stretched across the length of the span. Each one needed to be more than a mile long to cover the distance end to end. The road deck was so slim, consisting of welded sections of plate girder just 8 feet deep and 39 feet wide, that it could be prefabricated on site and then shipped to the bridge to be hoisted into place. Only 19 months after construction began, the third longest suspension bridge in the world was finished and ready for traffic. However, it soon became apparent that not all was well with Moiseev's beautiful bridge. Most of the men who erected the Tacoma Narrows Bridge were experienced bridge workers. Known as boomers, they would travel from project to project, becoming subject matter experts in the complicated business of bridge building. Many of the boomers had gone directly from working on the Golden Gate Bridge to Tacoma, and as the bridge neared completion, they could tell something was weird about this bridge. Namely, it wouldn't stay still. All bridges move slightly when the wind is blowing. It's accounted for in the design process, and most of the time is so small you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. But the vertical undulations on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge were, in a word, pronounced, which if you've seen the footage like I have, which is probably being overlaid my words right now as I'm speaking, that's the understatement of the century, and you could not pay me $1 million to cross that bridge. The entire bridge rippling up and down several feet at a time like ocean waves. The motion was so noticeable that it was possible to drive a car across the span and witness the vehicle in front of you disappear for a few seconds as the bridge moved. Even a gentle breeze was enough to make the bridge move around, far less than what it had been designed for. The boomers, who noticed this movement even before the bridge opened to traffic, gave the bridge the nickname Galloping Gertie, and the name stuck in the minds of the public after the opening day ceremonies on July 1st, 1940. Engineers, including Moisuf, were baffled. All their calculations had stipulated that the bridge was solid. It had been built correctly, and yet the bridge was doing something it wasn't supposed to do. It remained open, however, since the movement was not considered dangerous. In fact, thrill seekers paid to cross the bridge specifically because of the movement, like a low-cost carnival ride. Others who might have used the bridge avoided it because it made them nauseous. Engineers went to work studying the problem, placing a movie camera on top of the toll booth to record the motion of the bridge, while Professor Bert Farquharson of the University of Washington placed scale models of the bridge into a wind tunnel to test out various parameters. This was the first time that a bridge had been studied using this machine, which up to that point had been almost exclusively used to test aircraft. A number of fixes were tried with no success. Additional rounds of testing were completed on November 2, 1940, and a more comprehensive fix was planned. However, this was never implemented because only 5 days later, disaster struck. On the morning of November 7, 1940, winds in excess of 40 miles per hour whipped across the Narrows as a storm blew in off the Pacific Ocean. The bridge initially behaved much as it had for the last 4 months, with a pronounced up and down oscillation that didn't prompt concern beyond taking the precaution of closing the bridge to traffic. Then, at around 10 a.m., engineers and onlookers noticed a sudden change. The bridge was now twisting from side to side, something it had never done before, movement that didn't even appear in the earlier wind tunnel tests. Galloping Gertie was going wild. 2 vehicles were trapped on the bridge by this wild, undulating motion: a delivery truck that tipped over, forcing the 2 occupants to flee, and a car driven by the editor of Tacoma's News Tribune, Leonard Coatsworth. He was forced to abandon his vehicle, leaving behind his daughter's terrified Cocker Spaniel, Tubby, who tried to bite anyone else who got close enough to get him out of the car. Anyone with a camera rushed to the site of the unfolding disaster, taking pictures and movies of the twisting bridge that are almost too extreme to be believable. Bridge engineers could do nothing but watch in horror as the bridge swayed from side to side, hoping that Gertie would be able to survive the dramatic motion. But at 11 a.m., the bridge could hold itself together no longer. A huge, 600-foot section of the main span ripped free from its connection points and plunged 195 feet into Puget Sound. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, virtually all of the 2,800-foot main span had collapsed, taking both cars and Tubby the dog with it. Fortunately, there were no human fatalities. The huge crowd of onlookers that had gathered couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. A huge, modern bridge, only 4 months old, had just torn itself apart in winds that were less than half as strong as what the bridge had been designed for. The film shot of the collapse made its way around the world, appearing in newsreels and eventually being selected for preservation by the Library of Congress as being historically significant. In the aftermath of one of the most spectacular engineering failures of all time, an engineering board of inquiry known as the Carmody Board was impaneled to try and pinpoint the cause of the disaster. Originally, the cause was believed to be a phenomenon called forced mechanical resonance, when an outside force causes a structure to vibrate at a frequency that is the same as the structure's own natural frequency, magnifying both vibrations exponentially with disastrous consequences. This is best seen in a series of 19th century bridge collapses that were caused when large formations of soldiers marching in step with each other tried to cross them. After decades of study, however, the real cause is generally agreed to be something more common in aircraft design, called aeroelastic flutter. While similar to resonance, flutter doesn't require matching vibration frequencies in order to be destructive. Any sustained wind speed in excess of 35 miles per hour would induce torsional or twisting vibrations in the bridge, vibrations that would steadily grow more and more powerful the longer the wind blew on it, until the bridge tore itself apart. Whatever the exact failure mode, however, it was clear that Gertie had been too narrow, too thin, to stand up to the wind loads it experienced, and that was why she collapsed. In one dramatic instant, decades of commonly accepted knowledge about suspension bridge design was proven to be wrong. Leon Moisuf never recovered from the disaster, though no one blamed him personally for the loss of the bridge. The failure at Tacoma now cast a dark pall over what had previously been a distinguished career, and he died of a heart attack just 3 years later. It was clear that bridge designs now needed to account for wind-induced vibration, and that the overall effect of wind on bridges needed to be studied in more practical rather than theoretical detail. The use of wind tunnels to test both complete models and large-scale tests of sectional mock-ups have been used in almost every major bridge that has been designed since, even in the modern day when computer modeling is widespread. The Bridge Toll Authority now had a big mess on their hands. Their shiny new bridge was now a wreck, most of it resting on the bottom of Puget Sound. They also had trouble collecting the insurance money for the bridge. One of the policies was not payable because the agent had been pocketing the premiums, presumably expecting that there was no way anything was going to happen to this brand new structure right after it opened. He eventually went to prison for 3 years for grand larceny. Altogether, the policies only covered 80% of the bridge's cost, complicating efforts to build a new bridge. Although engineers were optimistic that they would be able to save money by reusing the towers and cables in a potential new bridge, eventually the whole thing was written off as a total loss, and the rest of the superstructure was disassembled and sold for scrap. The only parts that were kept intact were the concrete foundation piers and the shore anchor points. Then, just over a year after Gertie's collapse, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the US was in World War II. Now, the bridge wouldn't be replaced because all the necessary materials, including steel, money, and manpower, were now needed for the war effort. Even after the war ended in 1945, the state of Washington still couldn't start construction. The state had, for quite obvious reasons really, trouble finding someone to insure the new bridge. Finally, almost a decade after Galloping Gertie's collapse, the new Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened to traffic in October 1950. The new bridge was a dramatic departure from the old design. The road deck was 52 feet wide and 33 feet deep, reinforced by a stiffening truss. The towers were 58 feet taller and 21 feet wider than the original bridge, and the cables were almost 3 inches thicker in diameter. Although some engineers claimed the new bridge was over-engineered, this bridge, unlike its predecessor, didn't gallop. In fact, it got its own nickname, Sturdy Gertie. Sturdy Gertie's only problem since opening is that it simply wasn't big enough to handle modern traffic loads. Beginning in the 1990s, Washington began to explore the idea of a second span over the Tacoma Narrows, a companion for Gertie. The new bridge opened in 2007 and now carries eastbound traffic over Puget Sound, with Sturdy Gertie carrying westbound traffic. To this day, the infamous video of Galloping Gertie's collapse is studied by engineering students, both because it is a perfect demonstration of the aerodynamic forces at work and as a cautionary tale. Take care when designing your structures, or this might happen to you. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was doomed to failure from the very beginning, fatally crippled by a design that did not fully take into account the whims of Mother Nature. What was most alarming about the collapse was that it wasn't an isolated incident. Several bridge collapses in the 19th century can be pointed to as being caused by the same failure mode that took down Gertie. Subsequent engineers, like the Roeblings, took steps to mitigate this risk in their designs, but at some point the knowledge of these prior failures was lost, and it was believed the previous margin of safety could be eliminated with clever mathematical calculations. But at some point, the knowledge of these prior failures was lost, and it was believed the previous margin of safety could be eliminated with clever mathematical calculations. Galloping Gertie wasn't the only bridge built during this period to suffer from vibration problems. The Bronx Whitestone Bridge in New York has had to be constantly overhauled since the 1940s to keep it from moving. And even the Golden Gate Bridge needed to have bracing installed on it after a 1951 storm induced twisting motion alarmingly similar to what brought down Gertie. It is no exaggeration to say that every bridge built today is safer because of the legacy of Galloping Gertie. Sturdy Gertie was the first bridge design extensively tested in a wind tunnel prior to construction, which is now common practice around the world. Professor Farquharson, the university professor who took film of the collapse of the bridge in 1940, became one of the early pioneers of this technology. In civil engineering, success is often built upon a foundation of failure. By studying what didn't work in the past, engineers can build structures that are stronger and safer in the future. In that respect, the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge is one of the most successful failures in the history of the profession. The unique circumstances of its design and the spectacular and public nature of its fall will likely make it an ideal test case for junior engineers for decades to come. The one upside of this disaster, however, is that it didn't come with a body count. Well, except for one little girl's beloved dog. But still, that's a small price to pay for safer bridges the world over. And thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Remember to follow the link in the description and pin comment to get 20% off your subscription. It's a small price to pay to help keep your private data safe from bad actors. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical monument we haven't covered yet. Subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history's most important locations. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.